Hello and welcome. I'm joined here today by Reyna. She has a YouTube channel with very, very interesting and thought-provoking videos. I've watched some of the videos and was deep in thought after that for many, many hours thinking about the topics she discusses. So it's definitely not something for superficial content. And yeah, welcome, Reyna. I'm glad you're here. And tell us a little about your channel, your project, what you're interested in.
Mhm. Yeah, well, thank you for that introduction. That's very nice. I make video essays, and I'm also a writer. And I essentially cover what it means to be human, and I go through the lived experience and everything that that entails, which is quite a bit.
Quite a bit. Right. So you're saying you're a writer. What kind of things do you write about?
Yeah, essentially the same things that I'm making the video essays about. My preferred format is um, poetry, but I really think that at our core, every human being is a storyteller. Um,
Okay, what is for you like the essence of a story?
the character, the perspective. I think that's the heart of every story, which is why I think everyone is a storyteller. I think from the moment we learn to identify ourselves as separate from a setting, a surrounding, conflicts naturally arise, and a story builds from there.
Okay, so you'd say that for a story to arise, you need some degree of separation.
Yes.
A separation between, is it a separation between the character and the environment, the character and the world, or is it a separation between the character and some sort of task or an ideal version of the character that is trying to be attained?
I think there just needs to be a duality between someone or something that is observing and what it is that's being observed,
Okay. Okay.
which can be very meta in a sense, because you can also write memoir in which you are the thing that is being observed.
Okay. And the observer, is that like the narrator or is the narrator another thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's different points of view that you can take. It depends on if you're doing fictional work or non-fictional work. I don't think I'm creative enough to write fiction, so I typically do nonfiction. And although in my poetry um, I do try and adopt perspectives that you wouldn't normally encounter in the world, because I think that's interesting as well, to adopt the perspective of an inanimate object and see the way that they may observe you.
All right. All right. Yeah, that's interesting. What would that look like?
Um, Like, for instance, I was at the beach the other day and I was watching the water crash into the shore, and there were a bunch of rocks lining the shore. And I just wondered, when you go to the beach, you always think about me at the beach, or you think about you and the environment, but you don't think about the interactions amongst the environment, the way that the rocks feel about the ocean, the way that the rocks perceive us, the way that the trees perceive us. Trees aren't inanimate necessarily, but adopting a different perspective. I think
Hmm.
that can also enhance your creativity. Um,
Hmm.
and that can also be a spiritual exercise, adopting the perspective of something you don't normally consider in your day-to-day life.
There's a German, I don't know what you call him, ethnobotanist, someone who writes a lot about gardening and plants and nature. And
Mhm.
he makes a distinction between the German words beseelt and umseelt. So Seele means soul, and
Mhm.
beseelt means is to have a soul, and
Mhm.
umseelt is to be like wrapped in a soul. So
Okay.
he says humans and animals are beseelt. They have a soul. They incorporate a soul, and
Yeah,
plants and the wider nature is umseelt. They're immersed or wrapped in a soul.
that's that's really interesting. I find German really interesting because it makes these necessary distinctions. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it was talking about in German, there's a distinction between lived experience and just regular experience.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you maybe know the word for that.
Oh, is it like Erfahrung and Erlebnis or something? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think so.
Could be something like that. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting distinctions there. I don't know, are you familiar with the philosophy of Martin Heidegger?
Heidegger is very complicated. I
Yeah.
haven't read his work.
I don't actually know how it's even viable to translate Heidegger into another language because he's very, very unique to German, or the way he writes is very, very tailored to the German language.
Yeah.
And there's one distinction he makes, and there's no good way of translating it into English, but that's Sein und Seiendes. So it's being and beings. So Seiendes is that which is, and being is separate from it. It's a separate word, which means that being is not. It is, it is what enables beings. If that
Yeah.
makes any sense.
I think I've heard people say that true philosophy can only be done in German.
In German, right? Or in
Yeah.
ancient Greek, probably as well, no?
I think it's something to do with the language of German is attuned for philosophy, and other languages can't necessarily capture that. I don't know if that's maybe someone was biased who said that, but
I
it's
have the
interesting.
feeling that could actually come from like Heidegger or Nietzsche or something, right? It's
Mhm.
German. It's either German or ancient Greek or something.
Yeah. Well, I do think it's a coincidence, or maybe not a coincidence, that a good proportion of philosophy. They say that Europe is the birthplace of philosophy, but I don't know if there's um, like Western bias in that perspective.
I can well imagine like there's when the Upanishads were translated from Sanskrit into whatever English, German, Western languages, the philosopher Schopenhauer, he read them and said that it caused deep peace and happiness within him because he realized that they confirmed everything he'd been writing so far.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a way, you could say that the ancient Indians had like knowledge of certain philosophies thousands of years ahead of, you could say, European thinkers. So in the case of Schopenhauer, there's this distinction not between subject and object, but between will and representation. And that is similar to the big and small soul in the Upanishads, the Brahman and the Atman, where you could say the distinction, actually, to circle it back to what we've been talking about, it's not a distinction between one character and another character, it's a distinction between character and narrator.
Yeah, the seer and I guess what's being seen, because the two are not necessarily the same.
Yeah, and Atman, the small soul, sees itself like separated and like encountering a world, whereas Brahman, or the will, is not separated. It brought about the world as well as the small soul, the Atman, the representation. It brought about both. But you can't, as a limited being, you cannot remain in the state of Brahma, right? You are kind of thrown into your smaller soul, thrown into your Atman. That's part of the experience.
Would you say that's an experience that you've had?
You mean the unity?
The unity, or even the disunification, the feeling of being separate, the awareness of being separate.
I think that one's the most common one. I think the everyday experience is more the thrownness that Heidegger talks about as well, that you're kind of thrown into a particular, background, environment, family, history, with your memories. You're kind of thrown into that. And to some extent, you navigate that with your choices, but the initial state, I think, is the kind of being immersed and kind of, you could almost say, succumbed to the world and its influences. And then it's these moments of where the world kind of ends and it's thrown back to you. It's thrown back to your finitude, to your, you know, possibility of not being there anymore, that you kind of get yanked out of it, so to say, for lack of a better word. And then you kind of, you after that, you proceed to immerse yourself and succumb to the world again, but like in a new kind of transformed way. And I think that's just the kind of giving and taking of the experience.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's this ongoing pattern of remembering and then forgetting, but you need to forget in order to remember. So I don't think it's necessarily a state of permanence you're trying to achieve in this unity. I don't even think that's possible, that's sustainable. But what you're saying, it kind of reminds me of Jung, because his view of the psyche is that you have the self, and then you have sort of like the ego on top of that. And so you'll always perceive the self through the ego. There's no way to necessarily get around that, but you'll get glimpses of it. Let's say in like your dreams, you can access a little part of the self, but you'll never actually totally realize it. That's his view, which I think is on par with what you're saying.
Yeah, I've been a big fan of Carl Jung for a long time. I was at the Institute in his hometown this year.
Yeah.
And I would say that you can see the definite traces of him reading the likes of, you know, Schopenhauer and the Upanishads in his conception of self and ego. It's very much similar to the big soul and the small soul, Brahman and Atman, the will and the representation. And it is known that he read a lot of Nietzsche as well. Nietzsche picked up on this notion of the will, changed it a bit, but Nietzsche was definitely a very literary storytelling philosopher, specifically with his magnum opus, right, with his Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is in a large part incomprehensible. But yeah.
Are you reading the original like in German, or do you read it in translation?
I try and read everything in original if I'm capable to, so.
Yeah, but is it, I'm assuming there's a distinction between modern German and the German that was used to write it, or no?
Yeah, it is definitely harder to read than like modern German texts, especially because even in his time, German was already quite similar to today's German, but I think he went out his way to write it more like an epic, to write it more like in the style of, you know, the translations of the Odyssey and these kind of things.
I can't remember the term for it, but that's something that philosophers do often, and some of them are criticized for that, is they go out of their way to make their work very obscure. And I wonder if they're doing that because the topics that they're discussing genuinely are that obscure, or if they don't want to face the criticism of their work, so they purposely go that route.
I think it depends on the motivation for your obscurity. I think so. For example, the obscurity of Kant is very different from the obscurity of Nietzsche, and I think that's because of different intentions behind them. I think with Kant, it was like on one hand, a trend to be very scientific in your philosophy, to write everything down in paragraphs and very clean, and write it in such precise sentences that no one could interpret it in any different way. And so they're really long, convoluted sentences. And that was just kind of the jargon of his trade. That was kind of the way to be recognized and taken seriously in philosophy and in mainstream academia at the time. But Nietzsche, he didn't want to be part of this. He was an anti-philosopher, you could almost say. And I think he wanted to show off, I think. I think the way he writes is not to make it technically difficult or obscure. It's actually like to try and write a high art, like to try and write a very complex and refined piece of literature that is just difficult to understand, because he's kind of flexing his artistic skills there.
Mm-hmm. But I think that's why people gravitate towards Nietzsche who aren't even particularly interested in philosophy, because it's just a good piece of literature. But I also think about, like in terms of what you said about Kant, I wonder if, he was always destined to fail that mission, because there is no way to make a science out of philosophy, and that might be a controversial opinion, but it's because we're using language as the medium. So there's no way to get it precise or exact to what your meaning is. So in a way, you might as well adopt a flowery voice, an artistic voice, because you're never really going to get to what it is that you're trying to say.
That is an interesting point, because then you run into the issue of thinking about the philosophy of mathematics, science, and technology, which is kind of my area. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to engage in that properly and get away with flowery language. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if you want to think about where does our approach to truth come from, where does even the possibility of formulating theories that can make empirical predictions, where does that come from? You kind of need to be deep in the weeds of those theories and empirical predictions. You need to be familiar and capable of working around all of these theories of theoretical physics and math to really show that you know what you're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. And there, I think it's hard to get away, or it's hard to even imagine how you would unite that with a more flowery language. But somehow, I guess, if philosophy has the intent to be in a way unifying, then somehow it has to be made possible, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's interesting. You can probably elaborate on this, but with math is essentially a language as well. And I think it's probably the most precise language that we have. But even with math, let's say we've all agreed on this universal set of symbols, there's still gaps in that set, right? So even in math, we're not necessarily adhering to what we want to say is reality. But I'm curious to know, do you think math is invented, or do you think it's discovered?
That's a classic question, right? I think you could say my perspective is closer towards it being discovered, but not in the way that one may think. So to explain the situation better, there was this foundational crisis of mathematics in the beginning of the 20th century. I don't know if you heard of it, but the basis on which mathematics was unified axiomatically kind of was eroded by the so-called antinomies of set theory, published by Bertrand Russell. And after that, it kind of split into this different camps trying to unite mathematics in one kind of, as one science again, or whatever, if you don't want to call it science, as one discipline again. And there was these people, the people that claimed that it was a construction that sprang out of our intuition. Were those that claimed that you could find the ultimate formalism from which all math can be derived. And there were those that claimed that math is just as you kind of formulated it, a language, or let's say it's derivative of the syntax of language itself. And the interesting thing was, none of these camps could win this crisis, could fix mathematics. It was proven by Gödel then that formalism doesn't work, as there's always going to be incompleteness, there's going to be undecidable claims. He also showed that the syntax, if you just reduce it to the syntax of language, you would have to remove a lot of accepted mathematics from math, as a lot of it cannot be derived from syntax, such as actual infinities. There's potential infinities where you just keep adding n plus 1, but there's actual infinities, like real numbers that you just assume to be genuinely infinite, and that cannot be derived from some sort of sentence. That is
Mhm.
something you have to, pose as a sort of gestalt, an aesthetic in a way. And
Mhm.
then Goethe claimed that the way to go is a form of mathematical Platonism, saying that all of these structures are real and we are observing them, right? But the idea here is the shift shouldn't be like purely Platonic, as in there's some realm where math kind of hangs around and we're here, but it's phenomenological. So it's kind of, it cannot be reduced to one sense. It's not pure vision, but it is a sort of qualitative um, perception of essences. In phenomenology, you'd say Wesensschau in German, a perception of essences that can express themselves through one of the senses. So if it's visual, it can express itself through geometry, for example.
Mhm.
But it is like a qualitative perception that cannot be reduced to like one particular perception, but it is that which inspires the formalism we then write down. And that formalism is incomplete because it's bound to our language. But that
Mhm.
doesn't mean that the underlying object we're trying to formalize doesn't exist. Does that make sense?
No, I see what you mean in the sense that so you're essentially saying that it's both invented and discovered in a sense.
Yeah. Yes. In a sense, both. I was just saying that, like, maybe when I explain it that way, some people would tend to put me in the discovered box.
Well, it's interesting because there's there's a very strong element of intuition, and with intuition, we don't actually know where that comes from either, and so
Right.
that creates this like sentiment of discovery
Yes.
because
Yes.
you wouldn't say you created your intuition, but we don't actually know. So,
Yeah. When you write, where does that come from?
yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. And that's part of the reason why I get writer's block. Um, but um, there are things that I do to sort of incite the creative process. Like, for instance, visualization, that's really, really important, just allowing my brain to go wherever it wants. Um, and then also, I think in the creative process, not having any doubts on where your brain goes, because a lot of time you want to reject your own ideas, and you can't be afraid of making yourself feel like you're insane. You have to be willing to go to the edge, I think, to be a creative person, which is probably why there's a reputation that creative people are very unhappy or,
Unhinged.
depressed. Yeah, yeah, that too. But I think this applies not just in the realm of art or storytelling. I think this also applies in the realm of um, science or even math. I think you'd have to be willing to go to the places where your colleagues are afraid to go.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that's something that's probably lacking. The more people, or the more specialized sciences have become, and the more people are involved in it, and the more it's kind of become a paper production, paper generation, a scientific paper generation factory in a way. The harder it has become for this creativity to come through. And I think this has been confirmed by this meta study that was published in Nature, where it said that for the last years, this so-called disruptive science has declined.
Mhm.
And it's kind of ironic because, well, the science is largely represented by these publishers such as Nature and Science magazine, right? And in order to get your work published, it needs to be peer reviewed by the network of peer reviewers of these journals. And depending on how much the peer reviewers adhere to a paradigm, it becomes harder for like ideas that are out there, so to say, to get published.
Yeah.
So ironically, you get more ideas that are out there, let's say, from countries where you don't get paid enough as a scientist anyways, so you have nothing to lose, you know what I mean?
Mhm. Yeah, that's true too. But and I think that's happening across academia, in in the arts as well. Because now if you want to be recognized for your work, you can't just write your own work. You have to be responding to literary movement. You have to be responding to create something meta based off of something that someone else has written. And similar to philosophy, I don't think people want to hear anyone's original thoughts anymore. They want to hear your response to someone else.
Yeah, that's this kind of distinction between a philosopher and a philosophical scholar, and it's made us all to be scholars. Ironically, in an age where we have more technologies that could just do it on their own.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that this brings us closer to my topic, is like, to what extent can a language model such as, ChatGPT or AI technologies in general, to what extent can they successfully replace and emulate the creative process within science or even within art?
Well, that's interesting because I have asked ChatGPT, for example, to write a poem, and it's not doing great work. So I don't think it'll replace us anytime soon. But I actually make great use out of ChatGPT. I think it's helpful, but I think there's something intangible about the creative process. And it's not like, let's say that ChatGPT can write a novel, can write a poetry or a collection of poetry. Um, that's not going to replace individual writers because that's not going to replace their perspective. And I think that's what's always been at the heart of creativity, because I also think people have this innate negative response to the fact that they know that something's been created by AI.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the point with it not doing a great job, that could be temporarily, right? That could improve, who knows, right? With further versions of ChatGPT. But I think the point you make about the perspective is an important one, because ChatGPT is not going to, suffer a painful divorce, or, have their beloved dog die, or it doesn't have to be tragic. I'm just picking tragic things now, but it's not going to suffer that, and it's not going to have that impact on its whole personality, which is represented in its language structure, because it's not built for that, right? It's not made for that. It works according to a different principle. And the question whether it can fully, whether you can reduce the experience fully to just this string of words, how'd you say, technologically reproduced string of words that we produce, that is a very strong claim. I think that a lot of people make that is very questionable, or that definitely needs more justification.
Yeah, and another thing, I don't know, maybe you can enlighten me here, because I don't know what the thought process is of ChatGPT. Because, for instance, when I'm writing, I'm never using words. Like, words are the product of what I'm creating, but in the process of creating those words, it's a visual process. And so there's like a translation between the senses that happens in that process. And I don't know if that's the way that we can, I don't know if that can be translated, because I do think that comes out in the final product.
Okay. Yeah, so you're asking how are these thoughts and ideas represented in the technical system of ChatGPT, for example?
Yeah, because my understanding is that it's just using all the data that already exists to like assess what you're asking of it and then create something that meets your expectations.
Yeah, I mean, more or less. So that it's trained on a data set, and the units usually in language models are so-called tokens, and these tokens can be single letters, single characters. They also can be single syllables or words or multiple words. Usually it's words. So you just have a lot of words, and the approach is then to for a basic language model is to generate a continuation of what you input. So it can be made to complete your sentence, or it can be made to give an answer to your sentence. And that's just something that it needs to be trained with. And a large data set of text works fine with this, because you can just cut it up and then train it with saying, okay, this sentence continued like this. So that is an example of how you'd continue a sentence. And then it just kind of statistically processes and trains the weights for these dependencies. But then with ChatGPT, that's obviously more advanced than just a base language model. So then there's several other layers on top. For example, a basically trained layer that has been trained by human interaction to then output sentences that are better and more comprehensive for our tasks. So there was like an additional training or tuning layer that does that. And then it continuously fine-tunes that end level with so-called like reinforcement that you give if you like the answer or don't like the answer. That was a very, very simplified explanation. But yeah, you are right essentially that like, it's not like there's no notion of like some sort of multimodal transfer of information, that there's some sort of visual perception that then translates into words, at least not as far as I know.
That's interesting, because I guess in that regard, I think a huge element of creativity, and people might disagree with this, is novelty as well, originality. And I don't think these language models are ever really creating anything truly original. You're Irish, so are you familiar with Samuel Beckett? Yeah, when he wrote, I can't remember, when he wrote his trilogy, it like shook the literary world, because nobody thought that what he did with a novel could ever be done.
Right.
It's a story, but it's a story that does not follow a typical narrative structure. And I think that's something that could have only ever come from Beckett. I don't think a language model would have ever been able to create that.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I guess we can probably agree on that, on the fact that ChatGPT will probably replace a lot of the, let's say, kind of repetitive artwork, like artists that are hired to design a basic logo for a no-name company, or basic, I think, or like writers who are hired to write a basic text for a video description or a website and these kind of things. I guess a lot of this almost repetitive, almost factory-like art production, that is likely to be replaced, and will likely be replacing some jobs, perhaps a lot of jobs. But it's probably important, and I agree with you there, that to make a distinction between that and high art, but that opens a whole new can of worms, whether you can objectively, or whether you can kind of universally say that there is such a thing as high art, or whether we can't get beyond pure opinion. Is it just opinion that I prefer Justin Bieber to Beethoven, or can you make an argument that one of it is high art and the other one isn't, for example?
Yeah, I feel that way about literature as well, because there's no unified definition of what counts as literature and what's just a book, I guess. And I look at a lot of the things that are a part of the Western literary canon, and I wonder, how much of this writer's placement in the canon has to do with who they were friends with, as opposed to what they've actually written.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a whole difficult thing for itself. The only thing I can think of is there is such a thing as requiring a sort of sensitization or development of perception or perceptive skills, you could call it, for certain things. Like if you just compare it to something where it's uncontroversial that there's a difference between you just thinking up how things work outside, in nature, and the theories of established physics. The theories of established physics can yield technical results that no one can deny. You can make a rocket, you can build, power plants, bombs, whatever. There is a difference that you need to have studied, you need to have understood the math, you need to have understood a lot of the, rational, scientific, and logical concepts before you can engage in this. So perhaps there is an equivalent for art and literature. Maybe you could say there is a difference between pop music and whatever classical art. I'm speaking of music because that's more my interest, or what I'm more engaged in. Whereas in writing, you could say the same thing. I don't have a good example off the top of my head, but like whatever, like Beckett or whatever, Shakespeare, and then compare it to some sort of like Harry Potter or something that's like simple, whatever. Can you make a difference in the case that perhaps you need more developed, sensitized taste and perception, and that could be your argument for one over the other?
Yeah, that's actually a contentious topic in the literary community, because on one hand, you have a group of people that think that in order for something to be literature, it needs to have layers, in a sense, meaning it needs to be speaking to a particular movement, needs to be referencing something, i.e., you need background information in order to appreciate the artwork. And you'll see that in the types of artwork that win awards. It's usually making reference to another piece of artwork. And you'll see that also in film as well. And making reference to different eras. So a film that makes reference to mythology, let's say, or a poem that makes reference to something of that nature, as opposed to, I guess, something that would appeal to popular culture. It's simplified. There's not as many layers, which I agree, but I also think that if you need to understand all of the background, all of the history of a writer and the context in which they've written something in order for it to be literature, I don't think that work stands alone. So it's difficult, because understanding the context in which something was written in should add to your appreciation, but it shouldn't be necessary for it. And so now you'll have, in the modernist movement, people were writing poetry that absolutely made no sense, and that's the poetry you'll typically find in a school curriculum, in North America at least. And it was, I think, especially for poets, they're really only writing for other poets.
Right.
And at that point, I don't know if there's even a point to that. It's just a giant inside joke.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of modern art as well, to some extent, right? When they just put like a trash can somewhere and say that's art. So it's like you need to, they kind of, require you to become a snob, kind of. Like, in order to actually see some value in it, you have to be like in on the joke and on the club and on the whole culture. I didn't really mean that. Like, I meant some sort of, development that art invokes in you. Like, if you something akin to like a mystical or a deep experience when you encounter it. For example, I don't know if we go with movies, for example. I don't know. Have you seen 2001: A Space Odyssey?
I've seen the trailer, I believe.
It's an old movie from the 60s. I one of my favorite movies, but you need a lot of patience to watch it. So that movie, for example, or you've probably watched some movie of Christopher Nolan, like Inception or Interstellar or something. Seen some? Yeah. I'd say Interstellar is probably a worthy comparison to 2001: A Space Odyssey. So both are movies that are like 3 hours long with like organ orchestral music, very long and kind of deep story and talking about human future and family and trust and like intense emotions. And same with Space Odyssey. There it talks about the rise of consciousness, the rise from ape to human and all that. And then you watch Hangover, let's say.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So there is a difference in, like, I would argue you can understand or you can follow both movies. Maybe not Interstellar because of the technical stuff with, black holes and time warping, blah blah. But if you take that out, I'd say a Space Odyssey is probably simpler there as well, even though it's so long. I'd say you can follow it without needing all the background knowledge, but you still have a different experience or a bit different transformation kind of in yourself perceiving that than, for example, watching The Hangover or something like that.
Yeah, okay, I understand now. I see what you're saying. It's sort of, I feel like people think popular literature is merely for entertainment, and then, or I guess popular, um, yeah, literature, I guess, I don't know if you would use that word, and then something that would be a part of the literary canon is going to speak to a higher experience. I don't agree with that. I think that I think there is something spiritual that can be gained from any experience. Now, whether you make that connection, I think is sort of speaks to you in your own development. Um, because I think the work, when someone is writing, I think what makes the difference between whether they're writing something that I would consider art or something that just belongs in, let's say, their diary, is whether they're speaking to a universal experience. And so,
Yeah.
in the act of creating art, according to that definition, there's always something spiritual that can be extracted there, even in something as silly as like Hangover. Um,
Mm-hmm.
just like even the atmosphere that that creates, you're probably watching that with a group of friends. It
Mm-hmm.
probably transports you to a place maybe
Mm-hmm.
of nostalgia or comfort. And I don't think we need to gatekeep necessarily what is spiritual and what is high art in that context. Obviously, there's also an element of commercialization too. Um, but again, I think that speaks more so to the consumer rather than the art itself.
But then I'm wondering how would I wonder what would the obstacle then be for something like ChatGPT or an AI? Because I feel like a lot of the kind of, let's say, hangover type stuff. I don't want to slam that movie. I've enjoyed watching it. It
Yeah.
just became this example now. But a lot of that kind of art, I don't see any difficulty in generating that with AI. You know what I mean? So I'm like wondering, because you said yourself that there is an element that AI cannot replicate. And I'm just trying to tackle that because I feel like they're connected. I feel like it's the question about high art and low art is
Yeah.
tied in with this, because I said I'm pretty sure like artwork, generative artwork for like, small businesses, making a logo, designing a website, blah blah, all of this can be done just as well with ChatGPT than with someone you hired uh,
Yeah.
for its intents and purposes. So there's definitely somewhere where there's a line, even if it's blurry. Would you not agree with that?
Yeah. No, I agree. And actually, it's quite confusing now because I see what you're saying in the sense that these big blockbuster movies, let's say, they're following sort of a template. Um, but then my counter to that is high art is also following a template, because everyone is referencing someone else to an extent. It's sort of what reaction you want out of people. Um, because I also think that high art, it's not something you consume passively. I'll say that. Um, like you can consume um, low art critically, and you might not extract much. But I think if you're consuming high art passively, which is for a long time, I didn't truly find film to be an art form because I thought the act of watching a movie was very passive, but
Mhm.
my opinion on that has changed. Um, but then again, that's also not speaking to the art, that's speaking to the observer as well, in the sense that you never really escape the observer in the end. But I was saying that high art tends to evoke these emotions or these mental states that aren't commonplace. And I think that's the powerful effect that they have in transporting you into these mystical states or mystical experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's still then the question whether that can be made, can be reproduced technically, right? And I mean, whether the source of storytelling more or less can be tapped into algorithmically, right? And I think you and I have both kind of have the intuition that it won't or it doesn't, that there is something that, is somehow, tied to having a perspective, to being limited, to having a small soul, so to say.
Yeah.
But it's hard to pinpoint what it is, right? It's hard to pinpoint what it is, because if you go back to just looking at the art that so far has been made by humans, where would you draw the line to say this could be made with an algorithm, this couldn't, right? At this point, everything that's in the past can be made with an algorithm because it can be fed into the algorithm, right?
Yeah. I think something that we're leaving out here, that is an essential component of art, is why, the purpose of why art is being created in the first place. And I think the desire to create art, it doesn't just come from, I don't think we create art with the end goal in mind necessarily. That's
Mhm.
not a component. Whereas I think with these language models, you put them up to a task. They have to know what they want to create.
Mhm.
Um, Whereas I think another element to the creation of art is, what does it mean to have a perspective? And this is, of course, going to be my interpretation of that. But I think what it means to have a perspective is this desire to be more in a certain sense, to transcend that limited self, um, which I don't think a language model has that desire
Mhm. Right.
or
Yeah.
can emulate that desire.
Right. Yeah. It's always tricky to anthropomorphize a machine, and like attribute it desires and things like that. It's always difficult to think about these things. Yeah. I think, yeah, you're right. I think it's a good point you're making. The process of creating it is in itself a subjective experience to an extent. Like the immersion of your fingers in the guitar strings, or if you're, of the paint and with the painter on the painter's brush and all this. It's a different kind of immersion in your task. It's kind of like the paint or your hand is guiding you, or the art or whatever creative source it is guiding you whilst you're doing it. Whereas in the machine, it's an entirely different process. It doesn't mean necessarily that it cannot be artistic, but it is different from generating a painting or generating some sort of artistic image. It works via a different process than painting one, right? Than painting one on a canvas.
Mhm.
And yeah, yeah, perhaps it's a kind of a difference in quality. And yeah, a difference in quality would mean that you could mimic some of art that we have, but essentially it would still be its own thing.
Mhm.
Would you agree with that?
Yes. Um, yeah, I would agree with that. Um, and I would also say that, uh, when we speak about art, we also can't uh, negate the experience. Like art is always an interaction as well. And I think that a necessary component of art is that it needs to elicit some sort of awe in the observer, that whatever it is that they're interacting with was created by another person, which plays into the like distrust that we have for machines and technology. When you're looking at like a piece of art that was generated by AI, it won't be as moving knowing that it didn't come from the human experience, in the sense, because when you're reading something, you also, you're envisioning the person that wrote it as well to a certain extent. It sort of comes from this like voyeuristic component of the human being.
Right. But what about someone who, just isn't talented at painting, but has a very specific vision of what to visualize, and they try out all possible combinations of prompts until they get the right artwork generated, and then they touch it up a bit, edit it a bit, and then they finish that. Would you say there's enough human imprint on that to then feel like you're communicating with the artist?
In my opinion, yes. And I actually think that's the next frontier of art. I can't remember the artist. I think her name is Sugwen Chen. I might be mistaken there, but she collaborates with AI. So she designs these robots that respond to every brush stroke that she makes, which I think is fascinating. And people can debate on whether that's art. And I think that's absolutely art. Um, it's actually quite fascinating seeing human beings interact, because I think we're also very egoic and we only care about ourselves as a species as well. And so I think integrating machines into our work, it doesn't negate the human quality. I think that exaggerates it and emphasizes it as well.
Yeah, it all boils down to that question. It's a saying in German: "Ist das Kunst oder kann das weg?" It means, is that art or can it go away?
Yeah, I feel that way now when I see certain public sculptures. I was at the beach the other day and they made a sculpture out of a log and it just looks like a log, so you want to sit on it.
So
But
wait, how did you know it was a sculpture then?
there's a sign saying, "Please don't sit on this. It's art."
Oh, that's all all the information you got, that's art.
Yeah, yeah. And then there's a map, because I guess it's like a project throughout our city right now. But interesting,
Well, Reyna, I think this is a good point to end, a good lighthearted note. And I thank you very much for joining me in this conversation. It was very interesting, and hopefully to more interesting conversations in the future.
For sure. Thank you.